So good afternoon. So you guys enjoying the conference? I'm too tired to respond right now, right? It's a lot of information in the day and it just keeps on getting better. Well, today we're going to talk about, first we're going to do a little bit of review of Scrum. So I really can't see anybody with the light, so just show of applause. Who's doing some sort of Agile process now? Just applaud. Okay. Who has no idea what I'm talking about? Good. So I presume you're here because you're doing some sort of process and you're trying to get it integrated into a bigger company-wide enterprise, if you will, and they're kind of resistant. So what I want to do, well, first of all, let me introduce myself. So my name is Phil Japixi, or actually my parents came from the Netherlands in 1955, so the announcer actually had it right. It was originally Japixa, but we Americanized it. So I'm the Patterns and Practices Evangelist for Telerik, a leading control vendor in the .NET space. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've taken a bunch of tests, so I've got a bunch of certifications, and I do a whole lot of writing and speaking. So again, show of hands doesn't really work, but by applause, who's familiar with the Agile Manifesto? Okay. Who's never heard of it? And there's no shame in that. Okay. Great. So there were a bunch of really smart guys, and this just turned 10. This year, the Agile Manifesto turned 10, so it's kind of a big deal. There were a bunch of guys who got together and said, you know what? We're doing this wrong. Right? We have built up, we as an industry, have built up this us versus them mentality. You know, it's always controversial, it's arguing, it's fighting, it's contracts. It's not working together. It's not trying to achieve a goal. It's nitpicky. You know, projects are running late. They're over budget. We're not delivering what they want, right? Even though they may tell us one thing and we deliver what we think they tell us and it ends up being something else. So they came up with this very short manifesto. And what's so great about the manifesto on a couple levels is it's very short, right? Mark Twain once said, I apologize for the length of this letter. I didn't have time to make it shorter. Right? It's very, very carefully worded. And if we look at the middle paragraph, we talk about individuals and interactions over processes and tools. So think about that in your work, and you know, I'm not speaking ill of project managers at all when I say this, but as developers, how happy are you when the project manager comes around to say, how far done are you? Right? They've got their Microsoft project open. They want to type in a percentage. And as devs, we know the answer, right? We'll say something like 47.5%. Right? Because if you say 50%, they think you're making it up. So, you know, you adjust it to make it sound more realistic, but that's just, you know, so you can get your work done. We seem to have become, over the past 15 years or so, and it's been changing for the better, really just slaves to the processes more than the individuals' interactions. One of the things I like to do, when I was still in consulting, I just left consulting in September, I spent 20 years as a consultant, is you go in for that meeting, and instead of, you know, getting out the project plan and everything else, simple questions, right? Hey, Bob, how's it going for you, right? As opposed to percentages. And really focusing on the individual. And we're going to talk more about how we can get the individual and interactions into it. Just by a show of applause, how many people in the room are professional document writers? In other words, your job is to deliver documentation. How many of you have to deliver a lot of documentation? Right? How fun is that? You know, and think about what you're getting paid for. Are you getting paid for delivering documentation, or are you getting paid to solve a problem? And most of us, I would bet, get paid to solve a problem. Yet we get caught up in this documentation cycle that sometimes overtakes the project. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Whether it's an internal customer or an external customer, we have this history of where we would go in and, you know, it's an argument. Well, you know, we can deliver this much by this time and this much money, and if you want to change anything, then we have to go through this change process and you need to get these 5 papers signed before you can bring a resource in. We kind of ended up there. Think about when you go meet with your users to talk about a project or meet with a client if you're a consultant. What typically happens is you have the one side sit on one side of a table, the client, and then the consultants or the software developers sit on the other side of the table. And it's like a bunch of lawyers, going at each other. Do this next time you have one of those meetings. Wait for one of the people from the other side to sit down, and then sit down next to them on their side of the table. Watch what happens. You'll see the rest of the people kind of look around going, uh-oh, where do I sit? Because they're on our side. The enemy has invaded. And then the person who's sitting there will start kind of squirm a little bit because they're not used to somebody from the opposition sitting with them. But what's amazing is as you go through this meeting, all of a sudden you realize to talk to somebody, you have to turn and face them. And you don't have a table between you. And all of a sudden you start working together to realize the goal. Responding to change. One of the problems that we've created, we as the software industry, is that the users believe they only get to talk to us once every year, or 6 months, or 18 months, or whatever it is. So what do they ask for? Everything, right? Because they're afraid if I don't talk to them now, it's going to be another 18 months, and I don't know why I need this button on this page, but I might need it someday, so I'm going to ask for it. So we get a lot of things that they don't really know if they even need put in the requirements because they're afraid that we won't talk to them again. So all these things we're trying to address with Agile, the Agile movement. And when I refer to Agile, I mean little a, right? I'm not into the dogma. I'm into practicality. But the most important piece on that slide is the last sentence. And I'm going to read it. I don't typically read slides, but I think this is important enough. That is, while there is value in the items on the right, we value the items on the left more. Now think about that the next time you hear somebody say, well, Agile means I don't have to write documentation. Or Agile means no architecture or no plan. It doesn't mean that. Right? It means that you still do what you have to do. For example, I spent a lot of time working in healthcare. And healthcare requires a lot of paperwork, a lot of documentation. So we still wrote it. But we didn't let it overtake us. So there's a couple big Agile flavors that are very, very popular right now. Scrum is by far getting the most press. So show of applause, how many Scrum Masters are in the room? A few? Okay. So Scrum is people-oriented. It teaches us how to deal with the people and the processes. And what I mean by processes, I mean more of the non-technical processes in an Agile project. Extreme programming, now keep in mind, these guys all work together, right? They all work together, they all knew each other, they're all friends, and they went kind of different directions to achieve the same goal. XP, or extreme programming, deals with more of the engineering aspects of it, things like test-driven development and continuous integration. But at the end of the day, they're trying to solve the same problems, and they just have two different things, and it's like the old commercial that we had with the peanut butter and the chocolate. The peanut butter is good, and the chocolate's good, but it's even better together. And that's what we want to try and get across, is that you need both. So one of the terms, or one of the sets of terms that we use, and I'm really not a big fan of this, but it explains it very, very well, so I haven't come up with a good replacement. But there's a whole concept of pigs and chickens. And you guys probably have heard the joke. If not, I'll go ahead and say it. So a pig and a chicken are walking down the road. And the chicken turns to the pig and says, hey, let's open a restaurant. And the pig says, sure. Sounds like a great idea. What are we going to serve? And the chicken says, well, ham and eggs, of course. And the pig says, well, wait a minute. While you're involved, I'm committed. Right? So that's really the difference between pigs and chickens. When we refer to them in an agile concept, we're not calling developers pigs. We're not calling managers chickens. Right? Well, okay, we are, but we're not meaning it that way. Really, the pigs are the people whose ham is on the line when the project fails. We all know who the chickens are. They're the people who show up for happy hour when we release on time, and they're the people we can't find when things are going bad. Right? But they're really not committed or like I said, their ham isn't on the line. So there's three main roles in Scrum. You got the Scrum Master, and this is a coach. This is the cheerleader. This is I'm going to remove impediments or roadblocks. He or she's going to make sure that you're following the good practices and principles of Scrum and not doing Scrum but. You guys familiar with Scrum but? We're doing Scrum, but we substituted some things out, right? Which is fine as an evolved team. You can certainly change it, but as a new team, you probably want to stick to the rules until you figure it out more and how your team works. An important thing to note is it's not an HR position or a human resources position. You do not want the development manager to be the Scrum Master. And I've seen this mistake happen. And the problem with that is, if you think about it, for those of you that are familiar with Scrum, one of the things we do every morning, and we'll talk about it here in a couple slides, is a daily stand-up, where it's almost like a therapy session, right? But very short, where you say the things that are holding you back. And if you are hopefully you're not constantly having things holding you back, but how willing are you to admit in front of your manager on a daily basis that you're having technical issues? Right? The whole idea of exposing them is so we can fix them as a team, but sometimes that comes back in your performance appraisal, and it's not such a good thing. So we try and keep those roles separate. So the product owner is what we have traditionally referred to basically as a business analyst or the systems analyst, right? They're the bridge between the business and the technical team. The product owner is the one who's responsible for the product backlog, which is what we're calling the requirements these days. You know, whenever you come up with a new methodology, you have to change the names. Why do we need to change the names? So we can sell more books, right? But the product backlog is the requirements, and we're going to talk a lot about that because I think it's very, very important. But you only have one product owner. So I don't know, there's a movie that's been fairly popular among the IT crowd in the States called Office Space. Anybody see Office Space? All right, well, there's a scene in it where a guy gets hypnotized to not care about anything, and then the hypnotist, it's a comedy, so it doesn't sound like what I'm about to say, the hypnotist dies, and he doesn't get unhypnotized. So he goes to work, and he just doesn't care about anything. So he's just kind of walking around, and they're going to lay some people off, and they have some consultants. And they say, call everybody in, what's your job? And this guy says, well, I report to 3 different people. I can't make them all happy, so I just do nothing, right? How many of you have been on a project where you had more than one person writing the requirements? How well does that work? Right? Because what happens is I get my turn at the Word document, and I make all my requirements high level. And I make all of Bob's requirements middle, because mine are more important. And then Bob gets in and flips it around. Right? And then the other problem is, when you have a question, who do you go to? Right? You got to figure out who wrote the requirement. So one person is in charge of the backlog. That person does not work alone, though. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that you have a lone wolf or a wildcat running it. But one person is responsible for everything in the backlog. The development team is the technical team. And it's not just developers. It's quality assurance. It's technical writers, if you have them. It's designers. It's everybody who's a pig is together on the team. It's cross-functional. So hopefully you don't have these silos where This person only does database work, and this person only does whatever user interface, and this person only does services. Share across. You raise the level of everybody when you share that knowledge. You have to have a we mentality. How many of you guys have heard the phrase, hopefully not uttered it, but heard the phrase, it works on my machine? Right? We had a guy on a project who consistently broke the build, but it never broke on his machine. So what do? I went up to him one day, told him to log off his machine, unplugged it, picked it up, started walking out of the area. He's like, where are you going with my machine? I said, I'm going to production. This is the only place it runs, so we're deploying your box to the cloud. You've got to make sure that everybody is working together. I never use me or my or you when I talk about code. It's our code. Last time I checked, the person who signs your check really owns the code, not you, right? Unless you sign your own checks, then that's a whole other story. The other thing is you want to be co-located. That means everybody's sitting together. We didn't allow headphones, right? Unless you had special permission to put headphones into code. You want everybody listening to what everybody else is talking about. And you say, hold on, I can't work if a bunch of people are chatting. Well, they're not chatting about the latest football scores. They're chatting about the project. And that's always good information to have. Maybe you have information to add, or maybe what they're talking about helps you in your job. You don't need a phone. Everybody has a cell phone, right? So you don't need a phone on your desk. It's just distractions. Have everybody sitting together. So a sprint, we'll cover this real quick. It is a predetermined duration of work. Duration of work. It's a time box. It's not a scope box. When we talk about a sprint, we're talking about 1, 2, or 4 weeks. Not longer than 4, not shorter than 1. I mean, there are extenuating circumstances, of course. There's no absolutes in this business. But you must be consistent. Whatever you pick, you got to be consistent. You can't have 4-week sprints followed by 2-week sprints followed by 3 weeks. Pick something, be consistent. If you have to change because your retrospective says the sprint's the wrong length, you can change it. But it's not a casual decision. For me, my personal recommendation when I'm starting out with a new team is 2 weeks, 14 days. It's a very simple reason why. I think 1 is too short when you're working with a big company because there's a lot of stuff you have to go through at the end of a sprint when you're in the enterprise. 4 weeks is too long. 3 weeks is too hard to do math in your head. That's the only reason I don't like 3 weeks, right? If I've got 6 months, 3-week sprints, how many sprints is that? I'm not really sure. 6 months, 2-week sprints, how many sprints is that? 12, right? It's easy to figure out. So the product backlog, this is now our new requirements, or what we're calling requirements. But they're different. They're not the big, long pages and pages and pages of storybook and pictures with circles and arrows and a paragraph on the back of each one. They need to be concise. You have a description, a priority, and an estimate. Now let's talk about priorities. How many of you guys, show of applause, use what we call t-shirt sizes? You know, large, medium, small, that type of thing for your priorities. Or I'm sorry, high, middle, low for your priorities. How does that work out for you? Because the problem is you're going to have more high priority items than you can tackle in one sprint. So you as a developer kind of pick what you want to choose. Right? Me, I pick the easy stuff. The customer, our users, they have a different thing in mind entirely. So I always made a rule. You start with 1, or if you want to be truly a geek, you start with 0, right? Because you guys have the true geek alphabets here in Europe, right? They start with the 0 level. I always have to get a picture of that when I come over, because we start at 1, and I'm like, oh yeah, you guys are C#. But start at 1 and go to N. No duplicates, in order. This does a couple things for you as a development team. First of all, you'll notice a significantly shorter product backlog because people get tired of counting. And so that extraneous stuff, that button they put on there because they think you might need it sometime, goes away. The other thing is, when you're tackling your list that you're going to do in the next sprint, there's no ambiguity. Everybody knows what the high priority stuff is, and you're doing it in order. The other thing people have a hard time with is the fact that the product backlog is dynamic. It's not something we write at the front. We're not doing big upfront design. You can change it, you being the product owner, at any point in time except as we're walking into the sprint planning meeting. Then it has to be frozen. Once you walk out, business changes, whatever, you can mess with that product backlog as much as you want because we have our workload is called the sprint backlog. This allows a company to deal very effectively with change. The other thing you want to put on the product backlog are triaged bugs. And we're going to talk about bug triage in a later slide. So the sprint backlog is very simple. It's what the team agrees to do. Now there's a very important rule that I always try to enforce, and usually it worked, is you never bite off more than you can chew. Think about our history. Customers always asked for more than they thought they needed because they expected us to deliver less than we promised. It's one of those balancing games. If you start delivering exactly what you promise, the customer will start to trust you. If they trust you that you say, I'm going to do these 10 items in 2 weeks' time, and you consistently do whatever you say in those 2-week sprints, here's how it helps you. I'm sure you guys have had this. You're working happily, doing your stuff, picking things off the backlog, the sprint backlog, and that senior vice president comes in the room and says, Bob, I need you for a special product or project. Mr. Scrum Master or Mrs. Scrum Master, I'm taking him for 2 days, make do. If you've been delivering on a steady cadence where you're upholding your bargain, your promise, it's very easy to turn around to that senior level person and say, you can do that, but we're going to have to scrap the sprint and go through with the whole thing about what a sprint, redoing a sprint costs. Or you can wait 2 weeks and you can have it then. Because we'll make your item number 1 on the backlog. You'll have to talk to the product owner, but you're a high enough rank, it'll probably happen. And in 2 weeks you can have it and you don't disrupt the sprint that we're in now. If you've built up that confidence, that person will say, oh, okay, I can wait. That's fine. Burn down charts, simply a visible way to show what's going on. At the start of a sprint, you have a lot of work, no time's elapsed. By the end of the sprint, hopefully you're down to 0 work at the end of the time. I have some issues with this. I'm going to show you why I like some other ways of showing the visibility better. But still, it's a good way to keep from getting harassed by the chickens. Because if you have a burn down chart in your work area, all they have to do is walk through, and if the chart's doing, you guys are looking at it this way, going like this, then everything's good. If the chart has flattened out, then they know there's something wrong and they can come ask you. So it really enhances the transparency of your team. So the Scrum life cycle, and we'll just close with this before we get into the real meat of the talk, is a sprint planning meeting. That's where we're going to plan the sprint. And all these meetings and everything is time boxed. So if you're doing a short sprint, a week, it's probably a 2-hour meeting. If you don't finish in 2 hours, the meeting is still over. Done. Reschedule it, do something else, but do not go over the time box. Who likes meetings? Show of hands? Or clap? Yeah, I don't think anybody really likes meetings, right? The reason we hate them is because a lot of times we go to these meetings, it's an hour meeting, turns into 4 hours, we don't have an agenda, just a waste of time, everybody gets cranky, they're all sitting on their laptop checking email or texting each other. Time box it, get it done. Sprint, we talked about. Daily stand-up, we're going to talk, there's 3 more things we're going to talk about at length. before we get into the enterprise stuff, and then there's this daily stand-up, the retrospective, and the review. So planning, that's pretty simple. You take the things you believe you can do off of the product backlog into your own sprint backlog. At that point in time, you're still doing architecture, right? It doesn't mean no architecture. Agile does not mean you're not doing design. It means you're doing things just in time, or what we like to call the last responsible moment. When you think about it and you go back to the way we used to do stuff, where we'd have somebody writing an architectural document about how each web page was going to be designed before we even have a server stood up, it's a little bit crazy, right? So we do that type of architecture at the least responsible moment. Daily stand-up. In my mind, one of, if not the most important part of an Agile project. Everybody stands up. You're not sitting down. You stand up. Why? It prevents people from sitting there typing on their keyboards. It makes it obvious when they're on their phone, because people get really good at texting with the phone under the desk, right? It also makes you want to sit down, so you don't want to drag this thing out too long. Only pigs can speak, but chickens are allowed to watch. Now, there's 3 questions. Only one person can talk at a time. I recommend using a token. Now, one of the tokens that we used to use is I don't know if you guys have Burger King over here or not, but it's a competitor to McDonald's, and they've got these silly little crowns that come with the kids' meals, and I bring one of those in, and whoever was wearing the crown could speak, which meant you really wanted to get your talk over with so you could get rid of the crown. What did you do yesterday? What are you going to do today? And what, if anything, is holding you back? So yesterday I was working on the login screen. Today I'm going to be working on the login service, and I'm really not that familiar with Active Directory, so I'm going to struggle a little bit there. Now suppose Bob knows Active Directory. It is not Bob's time at that moment to say, oh, hey, what's your problem? I can help you. The Scrum Master writes on the whiteboard, Phil, question about Active Directory, and the token moves to the next person. One of the largest Scrum or Agile projects I was on had 19 people, and we still finished our Scrum in 15 minutes. Right? You can move that quickly. When that's done, then you have sidebars. So Bob will come talk to me about Active Directory, not tying up everybody else's time. So this does a couple things for you, right? It makes it very, very transparent what everybody's working on. It makes it transparent what problems you're having. So if somebody's going to be working on something that is similar to what you built, you can say, hey, well, you can't say it at that point, but you can come up to that person later and say, I just implemented a login service. Let me help you with that. It also exposes some problems that must be handled by HR or human resources. So let's say, for example, you have a developer who's not carrying his or her weight. On a traditional long-term project, it's very hard to deal with them. So what do? We kind of sit them in a corner. We give them meaningless tasks. We refer to it as making them boil water. And you just say, well, you know what? That's a head count that's not doing anything for us, but if we don't give him any real code, he won't hurt us. In the stand-up, if the managers are coming to watch just to see what's going on, maybe because they were invited to come watch, and an individual says, yesterday I worked on feature A, and today I'm going to be working on feature A, and nothing's holding me back, and feature A was estimated at 8 hours. And he has the same report for a week. Right now, HR or the manager can get in and say, hey, let's go talk, see what's going on with your productivity, right? So it really exposes. It's not going to fix the problem, but it will expose the problem. That's the beauty of the transparency of Agile. Sprint review, extremely important as well. One of the things you really need to do in the sprint review is get everybody who's going to be a stakeholder, all the key chickens, in the room for the review. This is not just for the benefit of the team. Demo the code. Show what's working. Show what's not working. At the end of that, give them a copy of the code to play with. And I don't mean that could be deployed to a server. That could mean make a virtual PC image and give them a hard drive, but give them something to play with. And we'll talk about why that's so important shortly. The retrospective, also very, very important. This is where you get everybody in a room, all the pigs, and you give everybody Post-it notes, little sticky notes, and say, write down everything you didn't like and write down everything you did like. Free will. I mean, it usually takes about an hour to go through this. And then you take all the stuff that people liked and you put it up on the like wall. And we were calling it the like wall long before Facebook. But that's the stuff you want to keep up. You want people to have a visual reminder of what is going well. The stuff that they didn't like, you take the one or two most popular things and you fix them. You can't fix everything, but if the build server is causing 8 people problems on a 9-person team, you fix that. And the other things you table. Otherwise, you're going to spend all your time trying to fix stuff. So what is Agile? Agile is about setting attainable goals, preventing death marches, where you're like, oh, I've got to get all these features done by this date. Transparency. Scrum is the people version, XP is the engineering version. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that we don't always get along that well. Oh, the team probably is getting along fine. But just imagine, and this happens, that you're on an Agile project, you're doing 2-week iterations, things are going great, and you're ready to deploy, and you figure, well, in the next 2 weeks we'll deploy to production, let me go talk to the hardware guys and see if we can get 6 new servers. And the hardware guys say, sure, when you need them, and you say, oh, well, next Friday, because we're doing 2-week iterations. And the hardware guy says, I need 6 months. And then the dev team says, well, we made promises to marketing and the customers, we have to deploy, so you have to make it work. Right? How well does that go over? It doesn't. So start off, and I'm not saying you guys aren't doing this, but start off with courtesy and respect. Understand everybody has a job to do, and their job isn't always yours. And respect the fact that they have deliverables. Teams don't work in isolation, right? Just because you're an Agile team, guess what? Those IT guys that are in the other half of these sessions, they control the stuff we need to put our code on. We got to be nice to them. Offer them a drink. They're free anyway, right? Those teams typically are not Agile. And maybe it's not by choice. Maybe they have to follow a certain process that takes a long time. Don't assume they are too stupid to get it, because that's very rarely the case. More often than not, they're in a situation where they cannot change the process, or they're trying very, very hard to change it and it's slow going. Be agile in your interactions. I don't know if you have the equivalent here in Europe, but they always made us take these Myers-Briggs surveys where it would tell us our personality, right? And my wife and I are very, very different people. I am very outgoing. She's not nearly as outgoing. I can talk for a while, but I also tend to get to the point very quickly. So my wife will say something to me like, how was your day? And I'll say, it was fine. And my wife, and I love my wife, don't get me wrong, but she'll say something in the effect of, why aren't you talking to me? And I'm like, what? I told you it was fine, right? So my wife comes from a long line of storytellers, and I'll ask her how her day was. And I'm pretty sure she starts in 1975 and builds up to what happened today with the kids in school. It's just the way she is. And it drives me crazy, right? Just as I drive her crazy with my short answers. So I've learned to be a little more long-winded and give a little more detail. Think about the people you work with, right? We all know the person that we work with. Well, if we don't all know the person, it might be you. But we all know the person that we work with where if you walk up and say, How's the project going? Immediately you go, I should not have asked that. We're going to be here forever, right? And you know that person, and you send them an email, right, instead of asking them in the hallway. If you're that person, listen up, right? Give the bottom line first. Let them ask for the more detailed information, right? People are busy. They don't always have time to hear the long story. But really the moral is think about how people are and try and compromise and be more like them. It's really going to help you work with these other teams. Is that Agile? I guess you could call it Agile because you're adapting to how they need to interact. But it's really not part of any book, right? So inter-team communication. One of the problems I had at this particular project that this talk came out of was they had done one release, and they said, all right, they brought me in because they had made a lot of enemies and people were angry about how things were done. And they said, Phil, come in. And they neglected to tell me all the snakes that were in the pit. But they said, first thing you have to do is you have to get this document filled out. It's our planning document for the project management office. I said, okay, I'll do that. I'll look at it, and there's a lot of questions for the database team, for the web services team, for the, all these different teams, security, et cetera. And I said, all right, I'll go find these people. And I walk up and I say, hey, Bob. Bob is always my persona that I use. They're not all named Bob that I work with. And I go up and I say, hey, Bob, you're on the security team, right? Yes, I am. Great. I'm working on, I just got brought in. I'm working on this project, and I need to ask you some questions about our next phase. Do you think you have a moment to spare? And he turned to me and said, what's your CA number? Or your cost accounting number? And I said, well, we don't have one. I have to get this document filled out so we can get funding. And his response is, well, I'm not allowed to talk to you until you have funding. And talked to several other departments that way, and I went back to the head of the project management office, and I said, I'm misunderstanding this. How am I supposed to do this? He said, you got to figure it out. All right, I'll figure it out. I bought 20 pizzas, had them delivered on a particular Friday, and I called all these people I needed to talk to. And, hey, free pizza, come to the conference room. Now, how many devs will run away from free pizza? I don't know any, right? So these guys came, right? Guys and ladies came, and they're eating pizza, and I'm like, yeah, now that I have you here, can I ask you a couple questions? And you saw the light bulbs go on, and then it was the free pizza, talk about work, free pizza, talk about work. The free pizza won, right? I got the questions answered. I wasn't taking any of their day away. People have to eat. Right? Figure out ways to work with their schedules. Even after we got approval for meetings, because we got funding approved, we continued having these meetings where every now and then we'd buy pizza. Our release was going to be about 10 months away. I kept having these meetings beyond the document with all these other people and say, hey, now we're 9 months away. Here's what we're thinking, in terms of code. Do you still believe that we need 4 more database servers or whatever it was? And all of a sudden, they were part of the process. Instead of me going to them at the last minute and saying, we've decided this is how you're going to do your job. We said, here's what we are doing. You tell me how you want to do your job. And all of a sudden, they started coming over to the team area. And they would just walk by. A lot of times, they were coming by for the M&Ms. So one thing that we did was we had low cube walls and tables in a horseshoe. So the walls were about, I don't know, maybe this high, so you could reach over them. And we put gumball machines and M&M machines on the outside. So people could put, well, we didn't make them take money, but we could get M&Ms and they could feed the animals, right? So they would come by. It was a joke at first, but they got people to come by. And now they're talking, and now we're getting more information, and they're interacting with us, and the transparency just keeps getting bigger. And they're working with us instead of against us. As we got closer to the release, we met more often. Made sure that we were always in communication, asking their opinion. You know, I'm an MCDBA, which means I test well. So I have a lot of database administration background as well, but I never told the DBAs what I thought they should do. I asked them to tell me, and then if I had a different opinion, I said, oh, okay, here's what I was thinking. Can you tell me where I'm wrong? And sometimes I was right, and most of the time I was wrong. Product release planning. One of the problems you'll see with traditional Agile teachings is they expect you to sit in a room, hold hands, sing Kumbaya, code for 2 weeks at a time, and at some point in time, the client will say, I love it, you guys can go away to your new project. Right? And that's great. I never found that. If I found that project, I'd probably still be in consulting. Because, I probably shouldn't walk if I'm up on the stage. Sorry. What you need to do is you need to tell people how much you think things are going to cost, how long you think they're going to take. There's 3 things in the iron triangle, right? Time, money, and scope. You can't fix all 3, that's why it's called an iron triangle. So a good friend of mine taught me, because this is how he was running his division, is you fix 2 of them. Time and money. We will release on this day. We have this many devs. We are working 40 hours a week. This is how much it will cost. And they say, what will you deliver? As much as we can. And they go, well, that's not good enough. I said, it is if you do your prioritization right. Because more often than not, when you get about 80% done with what they thought they needed, as long as you're doing them in order, they really do say, hey, you know what? I think I'm good. Right? You can move on. If you try and fix all 3, everybody knows somebody's going to be wrong. So don't do it. Plan the release. Here are the major features, right? Order, 1 to 100 are the must-haves. 101 to 150 are the we would really like to have, and so on and so forth. They're still numbered consecutively. But we can say, you know what? We know we can get these things in 9 months. We think we can get these things in that same 9 months. These will be nice to have, and we'll just see how it goes. In that release plan, involve everybody. The product owner, of course. The architects, if you have different architects outside of your team. Enterprise architects, those types of folks. Security, infrastructure, quality assurance, again, if they're not part of your team. Anybody who's involved in the release, get them involved early to help plan it. Because you know what? That security person's going to say, we need to run an external audit. If they are going to say this, we need to run an external audit. We need this much lead time. It's going to take this much to do the audit, this much time. Guess what? That becomes part of your resource planning, your people, your cost, those types of things. But also, everybody knows what's going on. There's no surprises here. You told them from the get-go that in 9 months we're delivering something. And there's no way they can come back and say, oh, I didn't know you were releasing something. We need to schedule an audit. Users. We make fun of users all the time. Oh, my cup holder broke on my computer, and, the ID 10T key and those types of things. But honestly, if we didn't have users, we probably wouldn't be working. Right? Keep that in mind. They kind of pay the bills. Let's get them involved. Let's make them happy. Right? I could give you a statistic, but 98% of all statistics are made up anyway. The majority of software failures is not because the code doesn't compile. It's because the code doesn't meet what the users needed or expected. It might exactly meet what they asked for, but how often do you know exactly what you want when you're asking for something until you actually see it? So I talked about in the sprint review giving the users a copy of the code. After the very first sprint, give them something to play with. Tell them what works and what doesn't work. Right? We all know how frustrating it is to get that long email from a user who's testing the system and says, oh, these 27 things don't work. And you go, we told you they don't work. Right? Get the email out of the loop. It's inefficient. Allow them to enter in potential defects. Potential defects. So if you're using Team Foundation Server or some other defect tracking system, Team Pulse, for example, let them enter things in, but only let them mark them as potential defects, because they still have to be triaged. But that way, as they get the issue, they can just enter it. It's fresh in their mind. They don't have to remember to build an Excel spreadsheet or a big long email. But you're going to have to coach them. But you know what happens? When they start playing with it, they start giving you feedback early. And they say things like, I know this isn't how I asked for it, but this really isn't working for me. Can we change it? And it becomes collaboration instead of, this isn't right. And then we would say, it's what you asked for. And they said, yeah, but it's not what I meant. You should have known better, right? And that whole confrontation that we've gone through many cycles. Get them involved. QA. How many of you, by clapping, have quality assurance or dedicated testers on your projects? Oh, that's awesome. That's great. How many of you, by show of clapping, have their quality assurance or their QA cycle at the end of the development cycle? Yeah, so the problem with that, and I'm sure you guys know where I'm going with this, is by the time they go through their testing and give you the bugs to fix, it's time to release and you can't fix them anyway. Right? And you go, well, we'll get that in the next service pack, or we'll do a hot fix or things like that. So I had a tester on a project who was very, very, we'll just say old school, right? Very good, very meticulous, very detail-oriented, but very big design up front. She wanted to know the entire requirements so she could write all the test cases around those requirements from the very beginning. And I said, stop. Let's look at it a different way. I said, the only thing that we know for a fact that will be developed on this project is the stuff in the sprint backlog. Everything else is subject to change. Don't waste your time building test cases around stuff that might not be there. Ever. So look at our sprint backlog and start writing test cases around that. I'm not sure. This is different. Change is bad. Right? We've all heard that. But she did. And all of a sudden, she's testing as we're coding. And as we get a feature checked in as done from the development side, she's running tests against it right then. And she's entering those bugs right into the bug tracking system. And when we do bug triage, which we'll talk about next, we can determine if, hey, Bob just wrote that code. Another Bob, lots of Bobs. Bob just wrote that code. Let's put that bug back into the sprint so Bob can fix it because Bob just wrote it yesterday. How many times have you had to fix code that you wrote 6 months ago, or 3 months ago, or last week? And you look at this code and you go, I'm really not sure where I was going with this, right? Because a week is a long time in internet years, right? That's like 400 years in print. So get that stuff back in while it's still fresh in their minds, right? You're going to find a dramatic decrease in active bugs by doing that. Be careful not to overload. That's why we go into bug triage. And what bug triage is, it's a meeting that we did immediately after every stand-up. You have the stand-up, whole team stands up, goes through the 3 questions, Scrum Master writes on the board, now you have the sidebars. Immediately after, Scrum Master, Project Architect, QA, the leads, would go off and have a separate meeting where we looked at all of the bugs that were entered in the previous day. Potential or real. Well, real being QA entered them, right? You can't tell QA that they're potential bugs because they get a little upset. So we looked at all the bugs, and we looked at them and we said, yep, that's a problem, right? Or no, it's not a problem. If it was a problem, is it something that we should kick back into the sprint because it's an easy fix? Or is it something that's structural that we should kick back into the product backlog? And now that bug in the product backlog gets put in priority by the product owner along with all the other requirements. So you don't have 2 lists. Before. You don't have 2 lists. You don't have the requirements in the bug list. You have the product backlog, which includes bugs. So there's no doubt what you should be working on. You don't run into that question of, why didn't you get these features done? Well, I was fixing these bugs, which you told me to fix. If it's not a bug, all right, so from an enterprise standpoint, we had to track change requests as well. Technically, a change request is a bug, right? It's not matching what the user's asking for. However, if it's how it was documented, we were tracking it as a change request so we could improve our requirements or our backlog writing skills. So we could track down the things that weren't clear, look at them, and figure a better way of doing it. So that's one reason maybe to do change requests. I'm not suggesting we go back to the old days of change management process, but it's something that can help you do continuous improvement. So I talked about burn down charts not being my favorite way of displaying data. The biggest reason it's not my favorite way of displaying data is sometimes it's difficult to read. If everything is going down like this, then everybody's happy and there's nothing to worry about. If it's going like this and then flattens out, why did it flatten out? Well, I don't know. We have to have a meeting. We have to discuss it. We'll have to figure it out. Whereas a swim lane, and I don't know how well you can read that, you have, starting from the left, you have a whole bunch of different cards, whether they're notepads or post-it notes or something of stuff that needs to get done. That is your sprint backlog. You move them through the different channels or the swim lanes from in design, in process, waiting on QA, whatever topics you decide. As the sprint moves along, they move from, I gotta do it backwards, from the left to the right. And at the end of the sprint, all the cards should be on the right and nothing should be on the left. And everybody's happy. Woo, happy hour, right? If things are still over here on the wrong side at the end of the sprint, then maybe not happy hour, or maybe happy hour to drown your sorrows. But then you have to figure out what went wrong. If things are stuck in waiting for QA, and there's a big traffic jam right there, well, you know what the problem is. Our QA resources on vacation, Well, then we need to find somebody to backfill for that role. Or somebody who's doing development, and this is very Kanban, right? So I'm not bringing too much Kanban in, but then we need to figure out how we can get the flow going again. And this, to me, is a better way of doing the burn down chart because you still get the picture of work not done, work done, but you also know why things might be blockaded. Requirements. Again, by applause, how many of you really like the requirements that you get from your customers? Yeah, that's what I thought. And it's really not their fault. Honestly, when I was in college, I had a professor assign us a paper. We had to document tying your shoe. And it was a simple assignment, or so we thought. He was going to read our paper and tie his shoe by reading our paper. And if his shoe was tied at the end of reading this paper, we got an A. If it wasn't, we got an F, or a failing grade. Every single person in the class failed. We all document things from our own point of view. as much detail as we try and give, if we gave every single detail to make it completely clear, we'd spend all day long writing stuff, and we'd hate life. So let's look at requirements a different way. Instead of flooding you with detail, write a requirement in such a way that you can wrap a test around it. And whether this is a unit test from a developer standpoint, or an integration test from a QA standpoint, or a security test, or whatever, make it testable. How many times have you been given an assignment to make a fast website? And you say, how fast? And they say, I should say Bing fast. On a good day, that means you don't have to work too hard. Sorry, Bing. I love me some Bing, right? This is recorded. I'm just trying to cover myself. But it should be something that's testable. Otherwise, nobody's going to be happy. The customer who said, make it fast, will always think it's too slow. The developer said, this is pretty darn fast. But there's no metric to balance it out. Start with wireframes from user interface standpoint. A wireframe looks like it was drawn on a beer napkin. That's important. Because if you have color, I'm pointing to my monitor, if you have color on that screen, somebody you're showing it to is going to go, why is that button blue? And you say, well, let's ignore the blueness and look at the data that we're showing and see if that's the data you want to show. I really don't like blue. I understand you don't like blue. Can we get past it and look at that? Can it be green? Right? And then you get the color conversation going, right? You guys have all seen that, I'm sure. Make it look like this. 3 different products. I don't work for any of them, but they're just good products. Mock-up screens, Balsamic, and then SketchFlow. And I made it a tiny URL because the actual SketchFlow URL wouldn't fit on the page. But give them this. It's a visual representation. They can see it. It doesn't look done, right? PowerPoint doesn't have a compiler that I know of. If you do wireframes in PowerPoint, it's really hard to deploy. If they look done, they're going to want to know why it's taking so long to write it, or they're going to be afraid to tell you to change things because they think you put too much time into it. So start with wireframes. A picture paints 1,000 words. It really does. Designers. If you are fortunate to have a designer on your project, try and get them to work with you in an iterative fashion. The problem with traditional designers, and this is not a knock on designers, this is the way we've always done software, is they do a whole bunch of comps, right? And you guys, if you worked with web forms, you know what I'm talking about. They put a whole bunch of really pretty Photoshop pictures on your desk. And they say, go make that happen in IE 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and the CTP for 10 and Chrome and Firefox, oh yeah, and Safari. You guys have been there, right? It's really difficult when they do what we call seagull design. You guys heard of seagull design? It's like seagull architecture. They fly in and poop on everything and then fly off. Right? Get them involved in a continual basis. It doesn't have to be full time, but get them to come by a couple days a sprint to work with them on it. User stories. So there's a couple different ways you can refine requirements. User stories was first extensively documented by Dan North. I apologize, I can't remember who initially came up with it. It might have been Dan, but I've had some people send me some messages on Twitter that it wasn't Dan. But Dan gets credit on my slide, so Dan, here's to you. A user story is just a way of phrasing a requirement that fulfills 3 needs. As an X, I want to Y so that Z, sometimes called for the benefit of Z. As an X, there's a role. That's testable. I know who the actor is that's doing this. I want a feature, there we go, there's our defined feature, for the benefit of blank. It's amazing when you ask somebody to write down what the benefit is of a certain feature, how many times they go, I'm not sure. It just seemed right. I really wanted that button in the middle of the form that said push me. But I really can't think of a business need for it, so scratch it. Right? And then you have success criteria. So, the example, as an account manager, I want to be able to edit a customer's address so that we can effectively communicate with them. Testable. Success criteria. Given 2,000 customers, when selecting one, the form should load in less than 1 second. Testable. No gray area. The problem with this format, and it's not a knock on the format, not everybody thinks like this. As developers, you're probably looking at this going, oh, that's awesome. I want my product owner to start writing it like that. A lot of times, when I was doing Agile coaching and whatnot out in the field, I'd come across somebody who could read it perfectly fine, but couldn't write it. I liken it to my mastery of the French language. I took 4 years of French in high school, 4 years of French in college. My uncle retired to southern France. My wife and I went to visit him, and she's like, should we get a guidebook, a translation book? No, I've got it. I had 8 years of French. Got off the plane, and I could come up with my pencil was yellow, my pencil was long. And that was it, right? I just didn't have the vocabulary. But I could understand it when people were speaking. And that's what I find with a lot of user stories. Now, if your team gets it, it's a great way to do it. There's a lot of tools out there to support this, and it's called Gherkin, right? So Cucumber and SpecFlow and some other ones support this very well. Use it if it works for you. I'm not knocking it. What I prefer to use, and it's just my style, and I can teach it easier, so it's probably more a reflection on me, is something that Scott Bellwer came up with called context specification. Now, they both, Dan and Scott, both called it behavior-driven development. They wrote their articles about the same time. They had some discussions about it, and Scott changed his name to context specification. And that's supported in things like RSpec in the Ruby world or MSpec in the .NET world. And it's a simpler syntax for me. When editing a customer's address, it should load in less than 1 second with 2,000 customer records. It should allow an account manager to edit the address. So you have a context and you have specs. It should do something. When doing this, it should do something. To me, that has come across as much easier for people. Take one of them, I don't care which one, whichever one works best for you, and get your people to start thinking this way. You'll love life a lot better. How many of you, by applause, have a written definition of done for your software? Hats off to you. Think about it. If you don't define what done means, people are going to either work more than they should or less than they should. They're going to do what they think is done. And I'm not saying those people are necessarily wrong, but as a team, you should decide what done is. If you're writing an Xbox game, done is probably a looser definition than if you work for NASA. For example, maybe NASA should have included something that said, check to make sure all the measurements were in the same system. Right? Something like that. So from a developer, it's how many unit tests? What type of code coverage are you looking for? Do you require code reviews? Do you require any documentation? QA, how many integration runs do you require? Whatever the requirement is, just document it to make sure everybody's on the same page and you deliver the best quality product you can. TDD, test-driven development and behavior-driven development, not enough time to really go into detail and do this justice, but you should be writing your tests first. It will speed up your development in a number of ways. First and foremost, if you have good tests in place, your QA and your users start to trust you a lot more. And they'll spend less time doubting you and more time helping you get that better product out the door. Pair programming. Applause. How many of you are doing pair programming? Awesome. I would say all of you have done pair programming. How many of you have called somebody over to look over your shoulder to explain a problem to them? I bet everybody has. That's pair programming, right? Pair programming doesn't have to mean that you only buy one computer for two people. It's actually easier to sell pair programming if everybody has their own computer. You're going to have a slight reduction in productivity, but you're going to have huge increases in code quality because you're not going to make those silly little mistakes because somebody's looking over your shoulder. Now, you have to be careful who you pair with because you can't spend the whole day arguing about variable names. So the best way that I've found to do it is you have one person write the unit test, pass the keyboard over, that person makes the test pass. Then that person writes the next unit test, pass the keyboard over, and then that person makes the test pass. Switching in the middle of a method just means you're going to rename all the variables all day long. You should be polygamous. Don't always pair with the same partner. And I'm talking about coding, code, right? I don't want any tweets about that. But if you always pair with the same person, you really don't learn much new, right? If there's Bob, who really knows service and WCF, pair with him, learn from him. You're going to slow him down, but it will speed you up. And this Bob's really good at MVC. Pair with him, right? That way you start spreading the wealth. A friend of mine talks about reducing the bus factor. The bus factor is how many devs need to get hit by a bus for the project to go critical. Now, in IT or software development, when I say get hit by a bus, it does not mean walk out in the street, get hit by a bus. I mean you get a higher paying job offer from somebody else and you leave, right? That happens a lot more. You want that number to not be one, right? If we've got one person who the whole success of the project depends on, that person's getting a raise, either with your company or with another company, right? And if it's you, then you can just say, shh, Phil never said that. All right, a couple more slides. Sprint 0. This is the foundational sprint. This is where you don't necessarily have a team in play. That's one of the biggest problems I have is they'll get a team together and they won't have a product backlog. They won't even have a gross architecture figured out. They don't even necessarily have a project charter with funding, but they've got their team, they're ready to code. No. Sprint 0 is all that stuff leading up to getting ready to start coding. Sprint 1 is when you actually start working. Getting a build server in play, getting project funding, getting the product backlog at least flushed out enough that you can have a sprint backlog from it. Building the development environment. Whatever those things are that you need to be productive once you start working with the team, get that done before the team is sitting there ready to go. Otherwise, you're going to go through a lot of M&Ms over the petting zoo wall. The verification sprint happens at the end of the project. This happens after code chill. Now, a lot of people like to say code freeze. I would venture that nobody freezes their code. It just gets a little chilly, right? Because if somebody finds a bug, you're going to have to fix it. So it's not really frozen. The verification sprint is used for those outside things we have no control over. These are security audits. These are internal audits. This is performance testing, load testing, all these things where we just kind of have to sit back and let them do their thing and wait for them to give us marching orders. This is not the long QA cycle at the end because we've already handled QA. We've been QAing all along. And so they've done 9 months of QA in a 9-month project as opposed to 2 weeks at the end of 9 months of dev. These are those other things outside our control. What are developers working on? They're working on increasing their unit test coverage. They're working on whatever documentation they feel is necessary. They're working on those extra scaffolding type things that need to be improved that typically get left in the lurch because they're trying to deliver code. Because remember, shipping is a feature, right? You can have the most beautiful code that never ships and nobody's going to buy your product. But the devs should not be trying out that new refactoring tool in the middle of their line of business code. Right? They should only touch what will be deployed code when given a specific bug to work against. So in summary, survive the waterfall. There's an ancient Chinese proverb, I'm going to get it horribly wrong. But the gist of it is that every day there's an elderly gentleman who gets in the river at the top of a waterfall, goes down the waterfall, gets out the bottom, and continues walking on his merry way. And there's this guy who watches this a couple times and finally goes up to the old gentleman and says, I don't understand how you survived the waterfall. It should kill you. He says very simply, I don't fight the water. I let the water take me where it insist that I go, and I nudge it slightly in the direction that I want to go. And at the end, I end up where I need to be, and the water is not angry. Think about that in your organization. If you come into work and say, I saw this great talk on Agile. By the way, this is in your evaluation, right? And we're going to change everything because you know what? You guys are doing it wrong. It's not going to go over very well. You really can't change more than 10% of a company at a time without meeting fierce resistance. So think about how you're doing your processes and kind of nudge them in a different direction. Don't call it a stand-up meeting. Say, hey, can we just have a 15-minute huddle, talk about where we are? Hey, why don't you start, and why don't you talk about, what you did yesterday and what you can do today, and anything holding you back, right? Don't use the word agile. It gets everybody all jittery. Play nice with others. That goes without saying. Bring success to the table. Success is viral. When you start getting to happy hour on a regular basis, other teams will want to do so as well, right? You're not missing that match on TV because you got your work done and you're not doing these death marches. People will want to play in your sandbox, and then you can spread. Here's my contact information, phil@Telerik.com. My blog and my Twitter handle is Ski Medic. That's snow ski paramedic. I also volunteer as a national ski patroller, and I work part-time as a firefighter paramedic. I'm still very involved in the community in that sense as well. You can find more information on Telerik at Telerik.com or on our Facebook page at facebook.com/Telerik. A couple slides that the organizers want us to run. If you're not already on the newsletter, you can sign up for the newsletter right there, msdn-newsletters.be. There's lots of blogs and other information. You can watch this and all the other sessions on demand on Channel 9. I'm not sure when they're going to come up or be posted. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.